So when you look around what's happening in our nation, in our state, and even our local communities, does it ever make you ask the question, who watches the Watchmen? I know it makes me ask that question, and that's a question that I hope to answer for you today. Now, the answer, of course, to this question is that nobody actually is watching. Nobody is questioning. Nobody is willing to look very deep today, at least nobody in a position of power. And this is why modern censorship and control has actually become the dominant objective of the political grifting class, as I call them today, because there's actually great fear from them that you and I, that we might actually find out just how bad they really are. However, let's explore this kind of timeless concept in our modern political world today, just briefly, and then reconnect this age-old question to the challenge that faces us, we the governed, today. Now, most of my viewers know that I typically focus on local governance issues in my home state of Washington, but there are times when it is worth putting the problems that we kind of find locally into the context of larger challenges that exist throughout our nation. Well, that other Washington is basically located 3,000 miles away from my home state of Washington, and they may be completely dysfunctional and corrupt. Our geographic difference, basically, that difference distance that we actually have there, that doesn't actually insulate us from similar problems where we live. So let's get back to the question, who watches the Watchmen? Now, this is actually an age-old question. It's an ancient question, in fact. Long before I rode my bike a few miles from home to the comic book store on Pacific Highway, and I actually bought my first old Watchmen comic in the 1980s. This is actually a copy of that cover. The origin of this basic question is typically traced back to the 1st and 2nd century Roman poet Juvenal. And the actual original quote in Latin was, qui custodet ipsos custodes. Now, I was never actually cool enough to learn Latin, so forgive my mispronunciation, but essentially this translates into who will guard the guards themselves, or who will watch the watchmen, which of course was the inspiration for the title of that comic book that I bought and consumed so many years ago. Now, while the comic book series that inspired spin-off movies and was even featured once on a theme for a Star Trek episode years later, essentially the timeless question is more important today than ever. Centuries before the exiled Roman poet Juvenal penned this question, which was published in Satires, Plato actually addresses this issue a bit obliquely in The Republic, which was a book that I was actually required to read in college, kind of part of the core curriculum there at Columbia. But Socrates actually proposed solutions. In his primary proposed solution in The Republic was essentially to properly raise and educate the leaders so that they didn't actually need anyone to watch them. And this was a similar concept to the famous phrase attributed to Benjamin Franklin thousands of years later when confronted by a woman after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia asking him what type of government the Founding Fathers had given this new nation. And he reportedly replied, it was a republic, if you can keep it. Now, our Founding Fathers struggled with this question and repeatedly addressed it in the Federalist Papers and even in the Anti-Federalist Papers, debating the merits and the risks of our proposed national constitution at the time. Madison's famous quote from Federalist Paper 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, and if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself, end of quote. Now, of course, the traditional solution that Madison and his fellow Founding Fathers attempted was to actually create kind of checks and balances in government with divided government to make it more difficult for small, passionate factions of special interests to take over that same government. Nevertheless, there was a common recognition by the founders that despite their best efforts, they recognized that a man who was corruptible and would be corrupted by factions. So fast forward now to a quarter millennia later to basically today, and we find ourselves in America and around the world in the very position that the founders warned us about. We have this massive, bloated, and opaque government today. This is as true at the local level as it has so obviously become at the federal level. And this bloat and kind of expansive octopus of our Leviathan of governments today, of course, this has just been bloated and expanded and excused. One law, one bill, one court ruling, and oftentimes just one ordinance at a time. until it has become this Gordian knot of governance that, of course, far exceeds anything ever intended by our founding fathers so many years ago. And as predicted by many, it has become kind of this nightmare that we apparently plan to let our children someday inherit. So who watches the Watchmen? I mean, who really watches these guys in government today? Does anyone? It is very apparent that the original checks and balances crafted so carefully 2.5 centuries ago, they've basically eroded and corroded away, barely hanging on by a thread, if at all, any longer. The groupthink mindset that dominates government, not just the politicians, but more importantly, their handlers, the consultant class, the grifters who kind of profit from the corruption, the bureaucrats, of course, this kind of permanent political class. This mindset is shockingly elitist, and it can hardly be distinguished from what our founding fathers must have witnessed in England in their day as well. Now, our founding fathers desired to structure a government which got away from it, but as Benjamin Franklin stated so long ago, it's only a republic if we can keep it. And it appears to many that we haven't done a great job keeping it true to our principles now for quite some time. However, lamenting the problem that we're witnessing still doesn't answer the question that I started with this whole video today. So who watches these guys? I mean, obviously it isn't federal law enforcement. At least they no longer fill this role. Both the FBI and the Department of Justice at a federal level, they've really become political agents and instead have weaponized their vast power to kind of punish political outsiders and basically protect political insiders. And while this has actually been a problem for many decades, probably long before I was even born, it has become exceptionally embarrassingly obvious to pretty much every single person today. And this just can't be denied by anyone, except for maybe the sociopaths who benefit from the current arrangement. I mean, can it be corrected and fixed? Well, maybe. But the path to fixing this corruption probably involves a widespread removal of the leadership of these agencies. And I find few people with the spine or the willingness to actually do this. Now, the next question, of course, is, are the courts a real check and balance today? Well, sometimes. But that line is unfortunately eroding rapidly as well. I mean, I've experienced this myself in court, where the law doesn't really mean what it says, and political expediency often replaces the rule of law when convenient for the political class. In my own state of Washington, our state Supreme Court has repeatedly put on just a master class of torturing the language of our state constitution to repeatedly justify whatever the political class demands that they say it means. Now, most of our judges are now, of course, basically part of the same political class, and they often refuse to rule against the mob, who they had to appease before they had to put on their black robes in the first place. Outsiders are almost always doomed, and even those who can navigate the legal labyrinth are really barely able, rarely, to make an impact. And those impacts are important when they happen, believe me. And sometimes they actually do stymie the worst abuses. But the abuses still continue, and many of us are concerned about the trend lines that we're witnessing. Now, at the state level, federalism and even the concept of federalism has eroded so much due in part to the massive ocean of cash that's just funneled into the states by the federal government, with all, of course, the strings attached basically with this federal largesse that they hand out. And how many times have we actually seen cities, counties, school boards, and even state governments knowingly and even reluctantly voting for stupid policies and even unpopular things just because they want to kind of keep that federal grant cash flowing? I've witnessed this for over a decade and a half now, and rarely does anybody question why. And here's just one example that I personally had, even at a minor local level. I remember being a school board member, and in our small rural school district, we were being threatened and forced by the federal government to increase the amount that we actually charge our students for our school lunches. And we didn't actually need to increase these costs. We could source local food less expensively than the federal government said that we should be able to. And we wanted to charge our community the very lowest possible amount we could for these lunches. I mean, after all, school lunch programs, they aren't intended to be a profit-making exercise. It is, in theory, a public benefit that just needs to cover its own costs. However, from the Fed's perspective, this made the federal grants to our school district look absurd because they were giving us too much money for our free and reduced lunch program. So the federal government specifically said that we had to increase our prices and demonstrate movement towards the DC bureaucrats' targeted price range, which was almost twice what we charged at the time. Now, I offered to increase the price 1 penny a year, showing that movement, and my fellow school board members agreed. This was going to help supposedly show this movement in the right direction. And the feds came back, they actually did this, and they said that that wasn't enough. So they made us increase the price by 5 cents a year at the time. So we squandered just hours on this stupidity. Now, this story actually, I believe, is repeated tens of thousands of times in every corner of local government in every state, red or blue, all the time. This isn't about good governance. Instead, it's just about keeping the cash flowing, jumping through whatever hoops the feds tell us to jump through, and then making policy that would otherwise never be required in our local communities without the federal involvement. Now, let's look at my home state of Washington. And just because you live in another state, I will challenge you to actually look where you live, because you're going to find exactly similar situations. Doesn't matter red or blue. Now, in my home state, we have state auditors and local county auditors as well. And at some point in time in the past, shortly after our state became the 42nd state to join the Union in 1889, the concept of an auditor was intended to mean something. However, when I go back and research some of the problems that local activists in our state have experienced, even in the early years of the 20th century, over 100 years ago, it became apparent that the auditors were not properly auditing local or state government. The people were actually upset with cronyism, kickbacks, corruption, and other problems, and many reforms were actually forced upon the state against the will of the crony political class at the time. They were demanding lower taxes, more controls over spending, more transparency, etc. In fact, actually, when you go back and look at that era, the concerns are very eerily similar to what we hear today, the complaints I hear all the time, and some of the same ones I've expressed today. However, one trend that has only worsened over time has been the fact that local county auditors have essentially become mostly just rubber stamps of whatever budget fiascos and kickback schemes are created in local government. When problems are pointed out, they can find laws that tie their hands, or certainly rules that allow them to become passive participants in the process, and essentially restrict their ability to be any type of check or balance on the fiscal abuses of local government. Now, what about the state level? Well, this is where it actually gets worse. Sure, in theory, we have a state auditor that's supposed to audit local government on basically a regular rotating basis. It's something that dates back many decades now, but which in practice, it's actually not a real audit in any true sense of that word. Mostly they kind of pre-negotiate with the local government, a school board or city council or even a county commission, how to get the most favorable results, how to negotiate the final report, and then water down whatever problems are accidentally uncovered. Sure, every now and then they accidentally stumble on something so bad that it just can't be ignored, but these visits can hardly be represented as an audit in the private sector understanding of that term. Only the politically unfavored or completely sloppy clowns get caught with any real violations. Everyone else just gets a trophy and they pretend that all is well. Now, okay, so what about the media? I mean, there was a time, might be long ago, but there was a time when the media viewed itself as kind of working to expose the truth in government and the community locally. I mean, those days, of course, are unfortunately long gone. The traditional media mostly exists to, at best, just kind of parrot the narrative that's spoon-fed to it by the political class, or at worst, they are so compromised they spend most of their time attacking all who dare question authority. Now, some of the media bounces back and forth between covering up the truth and defending the state of bureaucracy. There really, unfortunately, are no Watchmen to be found at the traditional media anywhere any longer. I mean, the only time that we can find them do any real journalism anymore is if a politically unfavored person is elected and our traditional media gets the green light and clear instructions to attack that politically unlucky politician. So again, who watches the Watchmen? Now, government, surprisingly, won't fix itself, and it will actively spend most of its energy and time concealing the truth. Our judiciary is so compromised, most of them are afraid to do the right thing, and sometimes they do, but that's rare. Our traditional media now, they're captured by the political state and certainly won't do anything. So what's left? This is where you and I have to get involved. New methods of communicating the truth, exposing the truth, researching the truth. Just confronting the politically connected and powerful, just this big, powerful leviathan of modern big government. If you and I don't do this, there's nobody coming to our rescue. There's no secret grand plan to save us. You and I will have to muddle through this mess ourselves and do the hard and often thankless work to expose the truth and question authority. And ultimately, of course, to lead the very necessary reform efforts to fix the mess that has been kind of dumped in our laps. Now listen, it can always be worse, and it will only get worse the longer that we wait. You and I don't have to believe, basically, you don't have to believe me at all about how you and I are and any kind of alternate news reporting, that's the only path out of this mess. Our big government friends, they recognize the threat that the truth represents to their kind of political death grip on political power. And this is why they're so eager to support censorship and suppressing alternative media. Our political elite would not be spending so much time and money on narrative development, suppressing the truth, or shutting down all who question them if our questions and exposés were not effective. They know that when you and I and our neighbors and friends, we begin to wake up and we realize how much government needs to change, when that actually happens broadly enough, they know that their house of cards, based on corruption, it can come crashing down very quickly, and they know it. So, who watches the Watchmen? Well, it's you and I, and we need to continue to develop more effective ways to research and find the truth, to expose the truth and to question authority. We ultimately have to replace our failed institutions that have become either ineffective or corrupt, and we have no time to waste. It isn't easy. I think sometimes people think it is. I don't know why. We won't always be successful, of course, but we can change trend lines and we can have a much bigger impact than most people probably realize. But it's only if we realize how important our work truly is today for us and, more importantly, for future generations. We just can't hide in our homes just hoping this stuff's going to pass us by, that these times are going to go and it'll all be good tomorrow. It isn't. Not on its own. They will not. It is ultimately up to us to be the change that we want to see. And of course, the question is, how do you do this? How do you start? Well, no surprise to my regular viewers, but you need to show up, and let me close with a couple of simple, easy-to-start processes. First, stop obsessing about whatever DC drama you hear hyped up next in the media. Sure, you should pay attention to it, but don't obsess about it. But no matter how much you obsess about it, you're basically unlikely to be able to make an impact on that issue so far away. Instead, focus your energy and time on a project locally. Adopt a school board, city council, county commission, or some other part of local government where you live, whatever that happens to be, that needs attention, and frankly, which probably has had a bigger impact on your life, day-to-day life, than what's happening in DC. Start researching what is happening nearby where you live, and where you can actually have quite a big impact if you bother to get involved. Now finally, start to network with other local activists and concerned residents in your community who basically share your concerns. You'll find them. Start building your local teams to work to expose and fix the problems that you're certainly going to find. And that doesn't mean you have to run for office, maybe, but some people have to. But most of us are probably going to be needed to start somewhere, and showing up right now is the biggest step in the right direction. We need to remember that you and I need to watch the Watchmen. You and I need to hold our local government officials accountable at all levels. And we need to be willing to show up to make this happen. Because, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.